Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
Welcome to the Merryn Talks Money Weekly Roundup, our debrief on the biggest stories in markets and economics. I'm Merryn Somerset Webb, senior opinion columnist.
And I'm John Stepek.
This is a bit where you introduced yourself. Jeez.
And I'm John Stepek, senior reporter and author of the Money Distilled newsletter.
Okay, I'm hoping that the rest of the podcast is going to be easier to make him talk. Okay, John, there is only one big story in UK markets and economics, right? So today we are going to take a little temperature check on the Labour Party conference, which is on the go in Liverpool. We're going to have a talk about what the Chancellor and Prime Minister have been saying ahead of that budget coming up at the end of next month. And I know how you feel about this. You feel bad vibes, right?
I do. I don't like all of this talk about vibes having an effect on the economy, because I just think that's a bad habit to get into. There are too many amateur psychologists in economics, and it's really easy to say that things happen because people feel a certain way. It's always grounded in some material reality. As long as people get money, they'll spend it. If they don't have money or they're going to lose their job, they won't spend it. And it's basically that straightforward. However, that said, this is one of those slightly weird occasions where I think the mood doesn't help, because there's an event coming up at the end of October. None of us knows exactly what's going to happen, but an awful lot of the outcomes could potentially be quite extreme and actually quite bad for a lot of people's wealth. And so you can see why that may well be having an effect on confidence. We've already seen a sharp decline in consumer confidence, which should really be going up because it tends to go up when wages are rising in real terms. The latest PMI surveys of the manufacturing and services sector, although they're still in growth territory, they took a knock, and people mentioned the autumn budget as being something that they're holding off investing beforehand. So basically, the kind of very funereal tone that has come out of the top since Labour got into power is having an effect. And I think over the weekend, or certainly by this morning, there's been a sense, and probably it was that consumer confidence data, that they are starting to wake up to the fact that actually they're telling too grim a story and not giving people any sense of where the sunlit uplands might be. I mean, there's always been a punitive tone to the government so far, and I think that they will probably try and shift that before the budget comes along. But whether that means we'll get any clarity in what they're going to do is another thing.
Well, this endless talk about difficult choices. And I mean, for me, it all comes down to the winter fuel allowance. It really does. I mean, they've dealt with this in such a bizarrely wrong-headed way. You know, this announcement that everyone who does not get pension credit will no longer get a winter fuel allowance. So what that does is means testing, obviously. But the winter fuel allowance, because it's been universal for so long and existed for so long, has become in everybody's minds part of the state pension. It's part of the state pension. So people effectively believe that they've had part of their state pension taken away, or that part of their state pension is being means tested. And that makes everybody think, well, what else is going to be means tested? What else are they going to take away from the low income? This isn't just about rich people anymore. They're going for everybody. And, you know, rich people are already pretty nervy, right? We might talk about the number of people who are beginning to leave the UK, and the talk about the UK about leaving the UK is turning into action. But there's beginning to be this sense, I think, across the nation of, hang on a tick, what do I get out of this? And what are you taking away from me here? And I feel that they've done that really badly. I heard somebody on the radio this morning, a government minister, and I'm afraid I wasn't sure who it was because he turned it on and off again, you know how it is with the radio, pointing out that this could have been presented differently as something along the lines of, you know, the last government was constantly taking from the young and giving to the old, and we're trying to do the opposite. Could have presented it like that, but didn't.
It's really weird that it was the first thing that they came out with as well. I mean, in the absence of any other policies, virtually, the one that they decided to hang their hat on at this point was taking money from, pensioners who are like on the verge of not being able to afford it. I thought when she stood up and she said it, I thought okay, this is kind of a message along the lines of what you were saying about the Tories indulged, they old too much and they haven't. But even if that was your message, a better thing to do would have been to get rid of the triple lock, and downgrade it. At least then you're not taking money away from people. I mean, like I said, it's just a really strange way to do it, and it's a really strange thing to make your very first announcement.
Yeah, but it's also, this brings me on to something that I really want to talk about, which is tax, this idea of tax morale. And we've talked a lot, and Bloomberg has written a lot, and we'll put a link to some of the things that Bloomberg have written about the very high net worth beginning to leave the UK, talking about the UK, about smart schools in London, messaging parents to let them know that if they need help moving their child to an international school, their organisation is there to help. The various reports from UBS, from Henley, etc., suggesting how many millionaires we are going to lose from the UK as a result of these new taxes. And this comes down to this idea that people need a reason to pay taxes, that they need to be complicit with the government in order to be compliant. And there's been a lot of academic research on this. The World Bank has written about it a lot, about there's a dynamic relationship between the state and the taxpayer. And it's about two things. It's about the extent to which tax payments are enforced and the extent to which their payment is facilitated, but also in large degree about the taxpayer trusting that money is used well. And the OECD has done a lot of research on it as well. It's all about the degree to which the tax system is considered to be fair, equitable, reciprocal, and accountable. All right. And it's also, it's transactional. What do I get back? What do I get back? So if you look at countries like, I don't know, maybe Denmark, right? Maybe Denmark, where tax is very high, but people feel that they get in response to that very high percentage of tax revenues, a percentage GDP, that they get great childcare, they get great healthcare, they get clean streets, they get, reasonable court systems, et cetera, et cetera. Maybe they even get a pension that isn't means-tested. I don't know enough about Denmark to be sure. But suddenly, when you look around the UK, and our tax morale, if you look at all the surveys, et cetera, our tax morale is falling across the board and has been for some time. People pay their taxes. Compliance in the UK is high. It has to be, because the price of not paying your tax is pretty high. But the feelings about it aren't so good. Maybe you don't get much in the way of healthcare. Maybe you can't find a dentist. Maybe you're worried you're not going to get your state pension after all when you feel that you really paid for it. Maybe you're not thrilled about your other type of pension. Maybe you're uncertain about the type of pensions that people in the public sector get and you don't get. Maybe the potholes are beginning to irritate you. Maybe you look around at a welfare state and think, well, what do I get as a taxpayer? What am I getting out of this? And if the answer is not enough, then tax morale begins to fall. And then you get, at the higher level, you get people leaving, messages on school WhatsApp saying the Packers are in and that kind of thing. You get that. And at the other end, you get people beginning to do all the things that we've talked about before, work a little less, use wrappers a little more, try and think of ways of getting round tax, give more away before the 7-year rule for IHT, then maybe is a good thing for them to do, et cetera, et cetera. And so it becomes a long-term problem. And how do you get that back once you've broken down the relationship of trust between a government and a tax-paying population? That's pretty hard to pull back.
Yes,
was that a rant? That was a rant, wasn't it?
No, I thought that was good and fairly that wasn't ranty at all. Actually, I say tax morale is basically a measure of how much value for money people think they're getting from their public services to an extent, and also maybe fairness. Is fairness there as well? It's about fairness,
but it's not just about that, because basically, there's a rational reason to pay tax. You comply because the expected costs of not complying are greater than the cost of paying in the first place. That's the kind of rational bit. But there's lots of intangible stuff there as well. There's bits about, trusting the government, bits about believing in what the government does, bits about believing that your taxes are well spent and spent in a non-corrupt way, all these things. And a belief that the system works. But what I think has begun to happen in the UK is that there's this idea about how tax and spending should be organised and how money should be used. And obviously not just in this government, obviously, because it's pretty new, but the government before that and the government before that and the government before that, the ideal of how spending ought to be organised, and one's, and I hate to use this phrase, but I'm going to do it anyway, one's lived experience of how your tax money is spent is different.
See, this is really interesting. And one thing I wonder if, like, because nowadays when we talk about taxes, and this is a side effect of politicians ruling out any of the actual taxes that raise all the money. But taxes these days often seen as a punitive measure. It's something, I'm going to put, punishment taxes on sugar. I'm going to put higher taxes on alcohol duty. I'm going to put carbon taxes, all of that sort of stuff. And so effectively the idea is that if you're getting taxed, it's because some of your behaviour is bad. And I just wonder if that has not helped, that sort of our tax system being pushed from being actually a way that we all collectively pay for public services that we recognise we need, into something that's sort of meant to nudge us away from behaviours that a certain part of society has decided are not allowable or tolerable anymore.
Yeah. Or just a straight up punishment for being rich.
Yeah. Well, yeah, because that is I would say that's part of the other issue with the way that Labour has been talking since they came to power. There's almost a sense that you guys let the Tories kind of be in power for 14 years and now you all deserve a thorough thrashing before we let you get the
that'll
goodies.
Teach you for making money.
Well, yeah, there does seem to be an element of that as well. And it's very clear from talking to people that this time round, the rich, or, the mobile wealthy are, actually, to be fair, they moved to the last time the non-dom regime was changed as well. But this time they really are moving. And that makes a lot of sense because, as we talked about before, the inheritance tax change is actually
massive. It is the inheritance
massive.
tax that's the big deal. Yeah.
And so you can see why they would want to leave. So I think that the follow-on from that is, how much does it matter and how do we get back to some sort of semblance of a tax system that works?
Well, first you have to prove that spending is appropriate, that spending is fair, that everyone gets back, not everything they give in, of course, because that doesn't work in a progressive system, but they get back enough to feel that payment of taxes is rational. And you need to have a state that looks well organized and non-corrupt. And as you say, you have to stop making it sound like a punishment. One of the phrases that they constantly use in this government and indeed the previous government, that, those with broad shoulders should carry more of the burden. But what people are starting to say, well, those broad shoulders just make it a hell of a lot easier to carry your luggage over the border,
That's a good one to do it. I suppose the other problem is that, and I think actually this is something I do think is under-remarked upon, and I haven't got exact figures in front of me, but the income tax burden on the lower paid actually went down in real terms under the Conservative government.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's been on the go ever since Nick Clegg, hasn't it? Because it was one of his big ideas was that the personal allowance should be raised and raised and raised, and that the low income should pay as little income tax as possible, and preferably no income tax. That was something that he felt incredibly strongly about. And of course, like lots of these things, it sounds wonderful in theory. Of course, we don't want the low paid to pay piles of income tax. That would be terrible. We want everyone to have as high a net income and as great a living standard as possible. But once you start charging the low paid nothing, and so everyone pays very little, you have to start charging the rich more and more and more and more and more. Actually, in the case of the UK, the middle income people more and more and more and more and more, and then you get a little top heavy.
Yeah, this is the problem. It's not that it's not the rich, it's the moderately and averagely kind of well off at some point during their careers. We get a lot of people are going to be higher rate taxpayers these days, eventually, because the rate has now come down so much. And most of this, I guess, does boil down to a lack of political guts to just, fix it. Yeah, again, it's the same thing they should have done with the winter fuel allowance.
Well, it's extraordinary, isn't it? They used up all that political capital on the winter fuel allowance, which in the great scheme of things is nothing. It's pennies in the great scheme of the UK's insanely large public debt and fast-growing public sector and commitments to the population. You could have used that political capital to do something important, something better.
Yeah, and something that might have annoyed people as much, but they could at least have seen the point of it.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. Well, do you know what, John?
Anyway.
We're going to talk ourselves into misery here. We're going to talk ourselves into misery, and it may be that this conference is going to change everything. By the end of the week, we're going to be super optimistic, and come the budget, we're going to see this huge growth-orientated, business-orientated, wealth-creating, supportive budget, and you and I are just going to have to eat all those words. Tax morale is going to go to the sky, and everything's going to be fine. You want to bet on that?
I would gladly see that happen.
Okay, John.
I feel I will be disappointed.
John and I will organise that bet off audio. Thanks for listening to this week's Merryn Talks Money debrief. If you like our show, rate, review and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. Also, be sure to follow me and John on X or Twitter at MerrynSW and John_Stepek. This episode was produced by Summer Sadi, production support and sound design by Blake Maples. Question and comments on this show and all our shows always welcome. Our show email is merrynmoney@bloomberg.net.